great time to go get a sip of water and come back in. So, all right. Well, we are in the middle of a series on Christian virtues. And the big idea is this: as we experience God's love, it creates in us the capacity to love others well. I hope you've experienced that in your life. As you have experienced God's love, it has created the capacity in you to love others well. Now, the idea of this is rooted in a big fancy term called Wesley's moral affectional psychology. We don't have time to get into all of that, but we kind of hammered on that on the first sermon. And see, here, we're not talking about natural capacities. That is things that are just innate to us. We are talking about supernatural ones that are given to us by God and are refined into virtues by the loving presence of the Holy Spirit, which cultivates the love of God in our hearts. This cultivation creates virtues in the life of the believer. Now, virtues, just real quick, if I can... There we go. Are tempered motivational inclinations which allow us to love others well. Now, that's a kind of a technical term, but essentially what it is are these inclinations that we have within us that have been tempered. Think of tempering like a blacksmith, that have been kind of hammered out by God into kind of more stable inclinations. So some of us have inclinations to sit down and turn on our phones and scroll, binge scroll through Instagram. Some of us have inclinations to go out and water our gardens and all of this stuff. And so all of these things have been tempered over time, but our virtues work very similarly. We have these inclinations within us that are tempered by God's presence and His Spirit in our life. And so what virtues then allow us to love other people well? Well, the first one that we've looked at two different types of virtues. One's called a prosocial and one's called metacognitive. Prosocial means, big fancy word for, it helps us love other people well. It helps us connect with other people well. And then metacognitive means it helps you understand what's going on inside of you. Did you know that that's an important part of you connecting and loving other people, is knowing what's going on inside of you? Because some of us have connected with other people, not being aware of what's going on inside of us, and said and did things that we have regretted. And maybe we came across in ways that we did not intend to come across. So that's what these metacognitive virtues are about. So we've looked at a prosocial virtue, which is gratitude, the acquired capacity to see goodness in others and in the world, to feel appreciation and be moved to reciprocate that appreciation. And then the second one, this is the metacognitive virtue that we looked at. It's called empathy. And this is the capacity to tune in to the feeling states of others and temporarily take the perspective of other people. So today we're going to explore another prosocial virtue called compassion. And many of you have heard this word before. Many of you have practiced this. Many of you are very good at practicing this. Many of you, that inclination has been tempered inside of you, and you act that way a lot towards other people. Some of you have to do that because that's part of your job. But compassion is the acquired capacity to experience the sorrow and suffering and need of others. It's very similar to empathy, but here's the difference. We are then moved to help or better cooperate in some other way. So empathy, the difference between compassion and empathy allows us to take the perspective of the other person, to tune into their feelings. Compassion allows us to tune into their feelings, but it motivates us to actually help and partner with them in their suffering. So I have a video that I want to kind of show us here that talks about compassion.
So listen to this, Daddy. Last week, I had to fly to LA for a conference. So I board the airplane. Wait, was this for your... What is it that you do again? My animated series on ethics. Are you telling me people are actually still interested in hearing your Michigas? So do you want to hear my story? No. So I board the plane, and I'm just getting comfortable in my seat with my book, when all of a sudden, in the row next to me, a baby starts shrieking. Oof. Tell me about it. I'm thinking, the one time I'm not being woken up by Benjamin screaming, and end up sitting next to this car alarm. And I mean, this baby was loud. Even the other parents who were sympathetic at first were getting annoyed. What's the problem? Change your seat. Thank you, Einstein. Of course I looked for a free seat. That's the first thing I did. But there were already like 10 people racing each other to find a seat. And the baby kept screaming. So what did you do? So I'm sitting there trying to figure out what to do. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see a little 3-year-old boy wiggling out of his seat. He toddles over to the screaming baby and offers the baby his own pacifier. Psh, wow. I know. Here we were, a plane full of grown-ups trying to solve our problem. Meanwhile, this 3-year-old boy was the only one trying to solve the baby's problem. The boy is the only one who actually heard the baby. Why do you think it's so difficult for us to be kind to each other, Daddy? I think it's because we're afraid. Afraid of making a mistake, of missing out, of being taken advantage of or being hurt. Afraid of failing to live up to people's expectations, especially our own. But when we choose to connect with another person through a selfless act of kindness, we break the cycle of fear. And we quickly discover that everyone is a human being, just like you and me. And that on the deepest level, we all want the same thing. We're all the screaming baby on the aeroplane, longing for someone to hear us and help us meet our needs.
All right. So, the word compassion comes from the Latin word which is compati, which means to suffer with. Henry Nouwen wrote a big famous book on, it's big, it's like this big, on compassion. And this is what he says: compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into the places of pain, to share in the brokenness, fear, and confusion and anguish. Compassion challenges us to cry out with those who are in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, and to weep with those in tears. So why do we struggle to exercise compassion in the world? As Hanan asked his father, why is it so hard to be kind? His father's answer is fear. Fear of mistakes, fear of missing out, fear of being taken advantage of, fear of being hurt, afraid of being able to live up to the expectations of other people, and mostly our own expectations. But when we see others in pain, and we act to help break the cycle of fear, we realize that we are all people in need. You got that? You're a person in need. And first and foremost, God sees you. What we find is that compassion is so important to God that it is one of the foundational ways that He describes Himself to His people. If you look in the book of Exodus chapter 34, let me back up because I want you to know where we are in the story, because it's very important as we understand God's identity. First, God is leading His people in the wilderness to a promised land. He heard their cries, He freed them from the bonds of slavery, and He is leading them to a promised land flowing with milk and honey. God invited them to be His special covenant people. He's not just taking them on a journey to someplace really good, but He invites them to be the covenant special people with Him. And then He goes on to provide their needs, the water, the manna, the what is it, the quail. He begins to provide their needs in the wilderness. Then He calls them up to the mountain of Sinai to hear His voice. But guess what? They were afraid. So they send Moses instead. And they take Moses up there, and he's up there for a really long time. So long that they say, well, maybe God ate him or something. And so guess what they do? They build a golden calf. And they begin to worship it. Moses comes back, breaks the 10 commandments, and God looks Moses dead in the eye and says, Moses, I'll take my people to the promised land, but I'm not going with them. I'll send an angel. You lead them out. Take them into the land. but I can't stand to be with these people anymore. And Moses intercedes for his people, and he says, God, if you don't go with us, you might as well kill us now. And so God, in his gracious and compassionate and merciful self, says, all right, I'll go with you. And he says, Moses, I want you to chisel out a couple more tablets, bring them back up to the mountain, we'll do this again. He takes them up, but Moses has one more request. He says, God, show me your glory. Show me who you are. Let me see you. And God says, well, Moses, that's a tall order. I don't know if you can handle that, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you up. I'm going to put you in the cleft of the rock, and then I'm going to go by, and you'll be able to see the train of my robe. And this is what happens. And when he does this, this is what God says to Moses. He says, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger, and I am filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. This is God's description of himself. Now he goes on and he talks about how he's a God of justice too, and that's very important, and you need to know that, but we're focusing on the God of compassion this morning. And so, God's first adjective that he uses to describe himself is compassion. It is the Hebrew word rahum. It's that word that looks like a bunch of little lines on there. Rahum. And it is rooted in a word that you might not think. It is rooted in the Hebrew word rahim, which means womb. God tells us that compassion is centered in a person's core, and he invites us to imagine the way a mother feels about a vulnerable baby growing inside of her. He says, that's the way I am in the world. But this word is not just about an emotion, because virtues are not just emotions. It involves an action and is most used. This word, rahum, is most used to describe an action of God. His response to Israel's cry is that he has rahum. His response to Israel's need is that he has rahum. So when he reveals his character, he begins with compassion. Yet Israel continues to turn away from God's compassion and serve other gods. And this would lead to their exile. But in hope, the prophet Isaiah evokes the image of compassion once again when he says, yet Jerusalem says, the Lord's deserted us. The Lord's forgotten us. Never can a mother forget her nursing child? Can she feel no rahim for the child that she has born? But even if that were possible, I would not forget you. We see this same virtue because here's the deal, Jesus and the Father are one. And so we see the same compassion existing in the life of Jesus, in his ministry, in his teaching, and in what he does. Jesus calls us to be compassionate. He uses the word oiktirmos. And what that word is it's the exact same word that the Septuagint uses in Exodus 34 to describe God. And so Luke says we are to be compassionate, oiktirmenos, just as the Father is compassionate. Now Matthew says it this way, we are to be perfect as our heavenly Father is perfect. We are to love as our heavenly Father loves. We are to be compassionate as our heavenly Father is compassionate. Jesus, in his teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, is calling us to be like God the Father. Compassionate. Moved to help. Then Jesus, in his teaching on Matthew chapter 18, says this, then his master was filled with compassion for him. when he released him and forgave him of his debt. This is the one about the master who forgave the servant the incredible amount of debt that he owed him. And he uses another word, splankthesnes. This is a word that means guts. He says he was filled with movement in his guts. That's what it literally means. Again, the sense that when we experience compassion, there is a movement in the core of our being. There is something that we see that disturbs us within ourselves by the suffering of someone else, and then it moves us to respond. It is a gut check. It is like a mother who is concerned about the child in her womb, but it is like when you get punched in the guts. You ever experienced that? I'm not talking about being punched in the gut, really, although maybe you have. I don't know. That's an interesting story. We'll talk about that later. But have you ever experienced something that gave you indigestion, stress, pain of other people, that when you saw it, it just made you sick? Jesus says that the master was so full of compassion. He saw the position that this person was in, and it just made him sick. And so he forgave him. Jesus also in his teaching in Luke 10:33 uses the same word. And he says, then the despised Samaritan came along. After all of the, law-abiding Jews, well-respected religious leaders came along. The despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he didn't feel recoil. He didn't feel disdain. He didn't feel anger. He felt compassion. He felt it in his gut for him, to the point to where, at a great expense, he helped the man. Jesus also in 15:20 says this, so he returned home to his father. Do you know what this passage is from? It's from the prodigal son. The son who spit in his father's face and said, I wish you were dead. Give me the money that you were going to give me if you were dead. And then he goes and he blows it on wine and women and amusement. And then he comes crawling back to his dad. And he has a whole speech prepared about how he's going to try to convince his dad to let him at least just come and work, maybe sweep the floors in his household. And it says he returned home, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. And he wasn't filled with rage. He wasn't filled with disdain and disgust. He wasn't filled with anger. He was filled with love and compassion. And he ran to his son, and he embraced him, and he kissed him. Jesus also expresses this compassion of the Father in his ministry. He was teaching crowds, and they were crowding in on him, and he was healing and freeing people from demons. And when he saw the crowds, it said he had compassion on them. He looked at them, and they all wanted something from Jesus. They were people in great need. They were people who had leprosy. They were people who were blind. They were people who were missing limbs. They were people who couldn't walk. They were people who couldn't provide for their family. They were people who were suffering under demonic possession. They were people who had no chance in life, and they were hoping that maybe God would look at them and help them. And he wasn't angry. He wasn't full of disgust. He didn't recoil. It said he had compassion on them because they were confused and they were helpless and they were like a sheep without a shepherd. Jesus also expresses compassion on people in Matthew chapter 14:14. Well, it's actually really two feedings that happen. There's the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. Did you ever wonder when you were reading that in the Bible whether or not like they forgot that they had already written this story? It's actually two different stories, and there's a reason. One, the first time Jesus feeds 5,000, it is mostly a Jewish crowd. The second time he feeds 4,000, it is mostly a Gentile crowd. And in both cases, Jesus had been teaching all day. They had been sitting at his feet. They had been just gobbling up the teachings of the kingdom. He had been healing and restoring. And he looked at them. He had been working all day long. And he said he had compassion on them. He was moved in his guts. He was moved in his guts. And he told the disciples, give them something to eat. And that was a whole lesson for the disciples, and we don't have time to get into that. But he says, don't send them away, for they will faint along the way. I know what's going to happen. These people are going to suffer. You give them something to eat. And so then they go and they find, and eventually he breaks this bread, and he breaks open the fish, and he begins to feed people in a miraculous way. Very similar to what God did in the wilderness with his people. We see that Jesus exercises compassion on a man who had been blind since birth. They kept crying out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus looks at them. Everyone else was annoyed at these guys. And Jesus looks at them and says, Jesus had compassion for them. And he touched their eyes, and instantly they could see, and then they followed him. We see in Mark, at the very beginning in 141, as Jesus is starting his ministry, it says he was moved to compassion, and Jesus reached out and touched him. And see, there was this guy who was wanting to be healed, and he says, Lord, if you're willing, heal me. And Jesus, with compassion, said, I will. Now, there's some translations. Some of you have a translation, and it says that Jesus was angry. Now, what we find is, and so I just wanted, just a side note, you can take it, pull it out in parties. People will be very impressed with your knowledge of textual variants. This is a textual variant, but the oldest and most reliable resources tell us that this is the word that Mark used. He had compassion on them, and he reached out and he touched them, and he said, I am willing, be healed. We also see in Luke chapter 7, verses 13, when a widow son died, her only son. Jesus was moved with compassion, and he reached out and he touched him, and he said, when he saw her, his heart, it said, overflowed with compassion. And he said, don't cry. And he raised the son from the dead. Do you know why Jesus exercised so much compassion? Because he and the Father are one. Because that's who God is. Yahweh the Lord, the God who is compassionate. The Bible tells us that God's chosen and holy people that he loves, that we should clothe ourselves with compassion. The same compassion that describes the character of God in Exodus 34. That we should clothe ourselves with compassion and kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. That we too should be like the God that we serve. God is compassionate. Jesus is compassionate. But we too should be compassionate. We are to become like him. So how in the world can we increase the capacity to be compassionate? Some of you are like, Tim, I'm super compassionate. I got this one. I'm good. Empathy, maybe I'm struggling a little bit. Gratitude, I could be better. When we're going to get to trust, all of us probably have trust issues. But But I got compassion, and that's fine. And if you do, and that's wonderful, great. You can tune out, take a nap for the next 2 minutes, and then wake up and you can take the Lord's Supper and ask for forgiveness. So how in the world can we be more compassionate? There are a few ways that we can do this. The first one is we need to learn to develop social awareness. I've said this before, but many of us, including myself, and this is one that I really struggle with, are so lost in our own worlds that we really don't see anybody else. And when we do, we might have pity on them. We might have some sympathy. But are we moved in our guts to do something about it? Or do we say, somebody will come along and help them? We don't actually see people. And we're really bad, especially church people, and I've had multiple conversations with many of you about this. And it's not Heights First Church, it's every church. We go in and we walk in and we say, "Hey, how are you doing?" "I'm fine." And then they go to their seats and really they're falling apart. Maybe their marriage is falling apart. Maybe their kids are going off the rails. Maybe their job, they're about to lose their job. Maybe they're dealing with some sort of physical or mental health illness. And we talked about it last week. We see them, and they say they're fine, but they look like they're about to cry. And we go, okay, well, they said they're fine. We have to learn to develop social awareness and begin to see the people around us. The other thing that we're going to have to learn to do is to display and encourage more positive connection. And what that means is that we have to be the kind of people that others want to be around. If you want to have an opportunity to show compassion to other people, we can't be grumpy Gusses and Gusselinas. We can't be so wrapped up in our own business and our own dealings and our own issues. And can I just pause there for a second, because I want to back up, because as I was praying about this morning, the Lord struck me this morning, and he said, "Tim," he said, "the reason why you're so concerned about what's going on in your life is you haven't given it to me yet." The reason we're so concerned about what's happening with us is we have not let the Lord show compassion to us yet. The reason we're so upset about what's going on in our life is because we haven't taken it to him yet and let go. Okay. So then we need to become people that are more positive and people that actually become the kind of people that other people want to actually share things with. Because if people share things with us and then we begin to dismiss those things, or we say things that are incredibly insensitive, or maybe we just completely ignore it and then we start talking about what our problems. We're not actually hearing them. Or maybe they share something with us and we're like, "Oh, you're just overreacting." Okay, so display and encourage more positive connection. And invite authenticity and open communication. That's a problem, because sometimes we don't want to hear what other people have to say. We need to invite authenticity and open communication. We need to be honest with them. They need to be honest with us. We talk about trust as the foundation of a lot of relationships. How can we express compassion and be invited into very vulnerable places with people if we're not willing to be vulnerable? I invite authenticity and open communication. And then we need to learn again to practice empathy, perspective taking. Help me understand how you're experiencing this. What's going on? What are you feeling? What are you thinking about right now? And then, this is the tough one. Don't respond, don't react. So here's the difference. Reaction is instant, it's unconscious, it's typically survival oriented. It's a defense mechanism, fight or flight. And here's how the process usually goes. Panic and then proceed. We do this all the time. And in fact, I've seen people, when they're trying to be compassionate towards other people, get caught up like this. And here's what they do. They get presented with a need. They are moved in their guts. They are responding to the need of the suffering of other people. And instead of responding, they're actually reacting. And what they want to do is they just want to fix it really fast without really understanding the problem, without really understanding what's actually going on. And so they're responding, and everything is an emergency. And we got to move. We got to get this done. We got to do this, and everything has to happen now, or else we won't survive. And responding is a lot slower than that. It is based in conscious and unconscious thought. It sees the bigger picture. It stays in line with core values. And it weighs long-term effects. So here's how to respond instead of react. Here's what we do. First, you pause. Don't do anything. When you are confronted with a need, a difficult need, don't do anything. Now, if you're a nurse and someone comes in with a gunshot, you got to do something. But we don't have to fix this in 2 seconds. Pause. Second, pray. Ask God, Lord, where are you in this? Help us to be faithful in this opportunity. Lord, calm my spirit and help me to think clearly. The next one is process. Begin to process this. Allow the Spirit to guide your thoughts. Begin to process with what your capacity is and what you know. And then plan, and then proceed. Do you see how that's different than reacting? Oh, there's a need. We got to fix it. Blah, blah, blah. We got to do this. Let's just throw money at it. Let's just do this. And we're not actually dealing with the real hurt in the person's life. So we need to learn to respond and not react. And then finally, and this one is I wrestle with this one for a long time, and you'll see it in the journals out there. This idea of self-compassion, and I was like, oh, that's just selfish, and it's not important. And the Lord again said, Tim, you can't do the things that I'm asking you to do until you learn to be compassionate towards yourself. Self-compassion. Here, let me give you some myths here. Compassion makes us weak and vulnerable. Where the truth is, in fact, self-compassion is a reliable source of inner strength that confers courage and enhances resilience when faced with difficulties. Because research shows that compassionate people are better able to cope with tough situations like divorce, trauma, and chronic pain. Here's another myth. Self-compassion is really the same as being self-indulgent. Truth is, it's actually just the opposite. Compassion inclines us towards long-term health and well-being and not short-term pleasure. Research shows that self-compassionate people engage in healthier behaviors like exercising, eating well, drinking less, and going to the doctor more regularly. They tell us this all the time. I go to pastoral meetings, and they coach us on this all the time. You know why? Because pastors are the worst. We don't eat right. We don't sleep well. We're worried all the time. We're stressed all the time. We're dealing with high-pressure situations a lot. We're in emergency situations often. And they're saying, Pastor, you have to take care of yourself. You have to take care. They're bringing in mental health experts. Do you know that people are just leaving the ministry left and right? For a long time, you know who's been the number one sufferer in ministries? It's been families of the pastors. I've said this before. Early on in my career, I kept asking older pastors, and some of these pastors were very old. They were in their 80s, 90s, and I was asking them, and I was saying, I'm a 20-year-old guy, and I'm saying, if you had to do it all over again, what would you do? And they said, Tim, I'd have spent more time with my family. They said, I had the wrong idea. I thought, well, God will take care of my family while I take care of the kingdom. And they said, I had it completely backwards. God put me in charge of the family, and he'll take care of his kingdom. It doesn't mean that there won't be sacrifices that we make. It doesn't mean that there won't be long nights. It doesn't mean there won't be long weeks. But self-compassion, we think that somehow this is being self-indulgent when it's really just helping us actually make it. Self-compassion is really a form of making excuses for bad behavior. This is another myth. Actually, self-compassion provides the safety to admit mistakes rather than needing to blame someone else. It's kind of like this. If you went to a boss and every time you went to him and you said, hey, we messed up, boss, or there's something wrong with the process, there's something wrong with this, and every time you did that, your boss just absolutely crushed you and told you how terrible of a human being that you are and that you're worthless and that you're just a drag to this company, and every time you did that, how often would you go to your boss and tell him that something went wrong? But if you had a boss that said, hey, we made a mistake, you made a mistake, so we're going to help you fix it. And we're going to find the process that's going to make this better, and we're going to figure out why it didn't work this way. And then we're going to change it. But it's the same thing for us. What if every time we messed up, we just beat the snot out of ourselves? We wouldn't actually acknowledge what's really wrong and fix it. Okay, last myth. Self-criticism is an effective motivator. If I just beat myself up hard enough, yell and scream at myself, if I just get tougher on myself, that somehow I'll be a better person for it. It's not. Our criticism tends to undermine our confidence. It tends to lead to fear of failure. And if we are self-compassionate, we will stay motivated to reach our goals, not because we are inadequate as we are, but because we care about ourselves and want to reach our full potential. Self-compassionate people have high personal standards. They just don't beat themselves up when they fall. How do we cultivate more compassion in our lives? Here are some ways to do that. But ultimately, the bottom line of this series is that as we encounter God's love, we are able to love others well. And as the two men at the beginning of the sermon said, we are all people in need. We're all like babies on a plane, screeching out, waiting for some adult to come by and fix us. But the funny thing is, sometimes a 3-year-old is the one that does it. We are creatures in need. And God has treated us with compassion in Christ. And he continues to treat us with compassion in the Spirit and to draw us close to him. That's what this meal celebrates. The fact that the truth is many of us could probably be more compassionate, we could be more empathetic, we could express more gratitude. And I'm not telling you all these things and leading you into all these things and asking you to be more virtuous just because I think that you're terrible. Not. What I'm actually finding is that we're being invited into God's presence even though we're not these things. And we're recognizing that we're in need, and we recognize that God is a God of compassion, and he sees that need in us. Will we let him deal with it? I'm going to invite our praise team to come forward, and I invite Pastor Elise to come as we prepare our hearts for communion today. I want to invite you, if you would, come on up, Pastor Elise. I want to invite you, if you would, to stand as Pastor